22nd of the March 1990, Louis Dupree Memorial International Seminar on Afghanistan. Area Center, Show.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to open the session, Sunday session today. We call it panel G. And this panel, Margaret Mills will be the chairperson, the presenter, and she might introduce the scholars who are sitting beside. Thank you very much.
I hope that you all can hear despite the extra activities this morning. I want to thank you all for coming in the early morning, and especially for a very interesting performance. Especially to thank Nancy John and and many people who put a great deal of work into bringing this conference together. Oh no, please. Not in my nose. There must be a way to arrange it. Alright. Is this audible? Can you hear me? Hello? Yeah. Okay. Thanks, as I said, and especially thanks to Nancy and the organizers. The diversity of participants at this meeting, the journalists, the representatives of Afghan institutions, both pre-war and resistance, the government servants, Afghan and Pakistani and others who are here, members of NGOs serving inside and outside Afghanistan, and academics, all of us touched in some way by Louis Dupree's friendship and knowledge, are here together to celebrate him. Louis' ability to talk to just about anybody, and the quality of his interest in other people, the joy he took in trying to see situations through other people's eyes, should inspire us to emulate him, to occupy our own moral and intellectual spaces with candor and self-respect. To apply that same candor and respect in our efforts to hear what others have to say in their respective positions. Professor Ghani's point yesterday that we should develop the tolerance to see what others see in us is also well taken and should be taken to heart by all of us. When Nancy was working out the organization of this meeting, she juggled a range of topics and a lot of different disciplines, from the most practical to the most theoretical. But I think the most important quality of this range of interests and concerns that we have is the lack of boundaries in Louis' thought between the theoretical and the practical. If the theoretical is of any interest, it's because it helps us to understand the predicaments of real people, and in the best case, to alleviate their problems and our own. So today, we turn to so-called academic fields: history, anthropology, demography, archaeology, art, and literature. But in the end, we return to the very practical problem of cultural loss and how to ameliorate it. We may also be able to consider what has been learned, especially by Afghans, and how to propagate that knowledge in the wider world. This panel on documentation is concerned with history, among other things, but we must ask, who is history, and for what? It's an old saying that the victors write the history books. At the moment, we have no victors, and as a result, we are highly aware of the diversity of histories, of the role, of the nature of Afghan political, social, and moral order, and so on. In an oil culture like Afghanistan's, even in peacetime, The diversity of historical consciousness is perhaps more operative than it is in a text-worshipping society like the American one from which I come. If, as we all seem to agree, the Afghan future will be inspired by the Afghan past, it's fair to ask which past or pasts. It will soon be the case that the young Afghan adult generation will have been born and raised entirely in time of war. How is their understanding of the possibility of a peaceful Afghanistan being shaped, and by whom? What will be their resources for constructing for themselves a usable sense of Afghanistan's past? This problem of transmitted knowledge may be more acute in the technological sphere than it is in the political and the moral sphere. Politics and morality are rhetorics richly developed in wartime. But how will a generation of internal and external refugee youth raised in urban or pseudo-urban conditions marshal the knowledge to rebuild Afghanistan's mainly rural agricultural economy? That's one problem of many. Appropriate technology in the best of times is a delicate balance between old and new techniques. How can that balance be achieved when not only the traditional technical infrastructure, but also much of the knowledge of how it works has been massively disrupted by war? Whose resources can or will be brought to bear to reconstruct technical knowledge, and whose wisdom will be available to reintegrate the technical, both old and new, with the political and the moral? Knowledge has value, and here I'm making a plea for academics as being not totally irrelevant diddlers, but people who might actually have some work to do. Knowledge has value for both practical productive activities and for moral and political persuasion. Knowledge is therefore a highly politicized commodity. I will say categorically, and maybe inspire Paul Brooker to argue with me on the point, that there is no way to achieve political neutrality in information management. Information of all kinds is by nature political, because it is used by humans to pursue their various ends in negotiations with other humans. The idea of a depoliticized history is obviously laughable, but I would add the idea of an aid program, by the same token, because it deals in knowledge, among other things, is inconceivable without political exploitation. All resources, tangible and intangible, are the medium of politics. It was said in several ways yesterday, take away the money and see who follows them. I would submit that the money is only the smallest part of the resources which are there and are politically implicated. If this is the case, then the task of resource providers, most broadly defined, is not to prevent the political exploitation of their resources, but to recognize and take responsibility for the political priorities they bring to their tasks. And that goes for everyone else too. No one can avoid having a political agenda. Saida Abadeh's remarks yesterday caused me to see my own country's priorities in a clearer light, I think, but she also caused me to reflect that the increasing cultural consciousness of small countries, which she pointed out, and the intensifying parochialism of certain great powers, I think we can learn the United States, I can if she was too discreet to do that. At any rate, the cultural consciousness of the small and the parochialism of the large and powerful may well come down to the same thing, which is an increased desire to see the world through our own eyes. This desire may be more benign in a less powerful state, which has less ability to force its vision on others. But it seems to me that narrowness of vision is a liability everywhere. Cultural consciousness cannot be responsible or effective unless it includes an informed understanding of the alternatives, an understanding which I think Saida Abadeh amply showed us yesterday. These alternatives exist not only between but within societies, and hence the question of whose history and for what. Are we talking about the official bulletins of the various political entities? Are we talking about, at the other end of the spectrum, the oral family history of some small community somewhere, refugees' narratives, all the various forms that memories of the war and meanings of the war are taking for people? These alternatives exist not only between but within societies. As Afghanistan abundantly shows us, Eric Knaba, I think, will no doubt be able to expand on that topic in a few minutes. Paul Brooker, also, who's with us this morning, will soon tell us about some of the logistical implications of trying to create and manage a comprehensive cultural, historical, and physical database for Afghanistan. There are problems, as Nassim Jawad pointed out yesterday, with outsiders' ability to understand the workings of even the most basic institutions, such as the Shura Jirga Majlis system. How can we understand decision-making at the national level if we don't understand it at the grassroots level? The war itself can be seen as the definitive grassroots rejection of national-level planning which failed to integrate grassroots institutions and priorities. It seems to me the most recalcitrant problem of documentation is practical, not academic. For action, for purposes of action, ultimately for the use of Afghans in rebuilding their country and more effectively exploiting the inevitable for the use of Afghans in rebuilding their country and more effectively exploiting their inevitable interdependence, not dependence, but interdependence with the outside world. How will a viable center be created? We've been hearing some nasty things about the use of the term viability in certain circles. Viable to me means in touch with the physical priorities and decision mechanisms of the periphery at the grassroots level. How can the survival strategies promulgated at the household level by family decision makers, both male and female, be brought into closer symbiosis, closer harmony, more effective communication with the decision styles and geopolitical concerns of the center? An unproductive, ultimately disastrous gap existed between these two leadership styles in the past, and the split is also destructively present in our so-called academic division of labor. Anthropological micro-studies of community workings have not received much attention from geopoliticians. Folklorists have not paid much attention to demographers, but I now have an opportunity to do so since Dr. Omi is going to tell us about demographic issues in a few minutes. And vice versa. The micro people have not paid enough attention to the macro people, and vice versa. The problems of the lack of integration of small and large-scale understandings run parallel in scholarly and activist frameworks. The Afghan resistance ought to have convinced us, once and for all, both that the small scale and the grassroots are not to be underestimated, and that the national whole is unpredictably greater than the sum of its parts, especially the national whole evades any attempts to partition it, either for academic or for practical purposes. With this comment, I return for guidance to the mind that has inspired this seminar, the mind of Louis Dupree, eclectic, opportunistic in the best sense, a mind for whom boundaries of all kinds were to be respected but explored. Thank you. Our next speaker, I believe, is Jan Golemeyer, who also in his work exemplifies the sort of boundary crossing that I hope we can all appreciate. Thank you.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to draw your attention to widely underscored reflecting development which took place more or less at the low side of the military conflict in Afghanistan. So I would like to speak about the cultural changes of the last 12 years, which again naturally have to be treated as part of the much wider general social changes which have left no aspect of the every Afghan's life untouched. To evaluate these socio-political changes definitively, it may, however, be now too early, or too early yet. Nevertheless, we are faced with the simple fact that the military conflict in Afghanistan is just one side of a general socio-political and cultural modernization process. This modernization process has, in terms of ideological language, however, little to do with comparable processes of emancipation and liberation in other parts of the world. Rather, they are mainly dominated by members of a revolutionary vanguard who expresses themselves in terms of the traditional Western leftist ideas of revolution. However, the documentation of this modernization process is already underway, as can be witnessed, for example, by the representative of the institution of the ARIC. Let's have a closer look then at the circumstances which were responsible for the formation of this modernization process. Since the Russian invasion at the turn of the year 1979-80, there raged a war of liberation in Afghanistan. But that was only one part of a wide range of violent changes forced onto society collectively. Migration, struggle to survive, internal wars between different parties, individual murder of stigmatized persons, class struggle, emancipation of pariah communities, anti-centralistic independence movements, etc. All this went on in the same time and often in between the same people and at the same places. The Islamists parties were among the first to evaluate these events in the broader context of a revolutionary change towards the building up of a radical Islamic state. Why only they? I can answer this question, and to find answers may well be the future task of intellectual Afghanistan. Only so much. The enormous migration of the people within Afghanistan itself, as well as to the neighboring countries, Iran and Pakistan, the collapse of rural economy, the dissolution of traditional loyalty structures, and the destabilization of the former rural power elite, the experiences made in fighting against an opponent who was technically and organizationally so much superior, the day-to-day experiences in foreign countries, all these thousands of small decisive experiences have triggered off an underlying learning consciousness process in the resistant fighters and the sympathetic population. People have been compelled to reflect on former conditions as well as to look for answers to the questions on what the future social order in Afghanistan is to be. New experiences and a new consciousness found its expression in the organization of political parties, in the rise of new elites, and in the ideologization of the war, the politicization of Islam, and the reorganization of society. All these changes were responsible for the appearance of a very specific new political culture, which found its expression in a widespread press and publishing system. This again served as a kind of vehicle to rewrite history, to propagate new socio-cultural values, to create new heroes, and to strengthen social emancipation processes of formerly oppressed people. Let me comment on every point shortly, by starting with a sketch of the press and publishing system. When the reform program as a Territory Amin government slowly drove an ever-increasing number of people into the resistance movement, there were only a few options for publishing anti-governmental propaganda. These consisted mainly of distributing the so-called night letters, which were put on the walls or slipped on the doors. In the areas already liberated in 1979, there were neither technical facilities nor skilled workers. The situation was somewhat different among the opposition already existing in Pakistan, Iran, and West Germany. But it was only among the Afghan students abroad in Western countries, mainly West Germany, that the political groups had gathered experience in publishing periodicals, night letters, pamphlets, etc. Some opposition groups in Iran and Pakistan began their publishing after 1978. Generally speaking, the number of newly founded periodicals at that time remained limited. And that was until 1980. They addressed a small circle of insiders. The contributions were fairly simple and included non-professional war reports as well as unspecified ideological discussions. This situation changed, however, rapidly after the Soviet invasion. With an increasing number of refugees fleeing to Pakistan and Iran, the resistance parties gained an ever greater number of followers and began to organize themselves while at the same time receiving international economic aid. Since 1980, more than 300 different periodicals have been published or are being published by the different parties, groups and individuals who were active in the resistance movement. On top of this, more than about 1,300 to about 1,500 brochures, pamphlets and books have been published. Just for comparison, the number of monographs printed and edited in Afghanistan up to 1980 didn't exceed 3,000. The circulation of newspapers and magazines amounted to 180,000, whilst the number of different periodicals edited in Afghanistan up to 1977 was limited to 174 titles. Peshawar has become the most important publishing center. Additional publishing houses are found in Quetta, Lahore and Islamabad. In Iran, Tehran is a center for publishing activities. Sometimes magazines or brochures are also edited in Rum or Mashhad. In the West, Germany is a center for publishing periodicals and books. But periodicals have also been edited in Denmark, England, France, USA, India, etc. The publications are edited chiefly by the main resistance parties in Iran and Pakistan, but by small resistance groups and individuals as well. The larger resistance parties very often publish in various languages: English, Arabic, Urdu, German, Russian, Turkish, and in various places. The major part of all writing is done in the two languages, however, Farsi Dari and Pashto. The periodicals appear weekly, bi-monthly or monthly. Many periodicals are published irregularly. The circulation varies from a few hundred to several thousands. The contributions in the magazines include reports from the front, information on the situation inside Afghanistan among refugees or on the international scene, biographies of martyrs, historical and philosophical religious essays, the speeches of leading personalities and texts from the elite about the aims and views of the war, as well as about literary treatment as about the future shape of a finally liberated Afghanistan, plus a literary treatment of events in prose and poetry. Four broad political tendencies can be discerned in these publications: the ideas of the fundamentalist parties, then of the parties which follow traditional Islam, parties which propagate an enlightened Islam and democratic ideals influenced by the West, and groups in the tradition of Western leftist movements. The writers, organizers and printers belong for the most part to the newly formed cultural elite. Only about 1/3 of them has been publishing or working in publishing houses before the resistance movement started. Rewriting history, new heroes, etc. Far-reaching political changes are always combined with a new understanding of history. In this sense, the historical science served to legitimize new power elites, new ideologies, and new forms of rule. In Afghanistan, the modern historical sciences started off in the 30s and had two aims: to legitimize the modern Afghan nation state and to legitimize the actual ruling court elite. The first aim was reached through the construction of a historical continuity of rule from the ancient Haryana over the medieval Khorasan to the modern Afghanistan. The second aim was attained by telling the story of the heroic forerunners of the ruling clan. History ended normally with the notion of the Istiqlal in 1919, or with the condemnation of the, in a good rebellion sense or logic, illegitimate rule of Bashir Sagao in 1929. The publications of the Afghan resistance movements shook this way of interpreting history in many ways. First of all, by analyzing the role of colonialism, imperialism, new imperialism in Afghanistan, thereby constructing a continuity of Russian-Soviet intentions to colonize Afghanistan from the middle of the 19th century onwards to these very days. This meant automatically a discussion of the Afghan foreign and internal policy from Anamullah to the Russian invasion. Another trace of interpreting history was followed by taking a closer look at Islamic opposition movements to the modernization attempts of the court. Several publications deal therefore with the role of the so-called rubber king, Bashir Sagao. Whilst up to the 80s, still every Afghan child had to learn about the disastrous rule of that king, who with his wild bunch of followers represented for the modern Afghan history a kind of apocalyptic rider. He soon was styled Robin Hood of the poor and oppressed, and an upright Muslim who fought the evil influence of the then reformed King Amanullah. The rehabilitation of Bashir Sagao corresponded to the condemnation, naturally, of Amanullah and his reforms. Amanullah became, using here the Iranian term, Rab Zadagi, Western devil or something like that. Whilst his reforms were defined as opening Afghanistan's doors widely to Soviet influence. Narrowly connected with the reinterpretation of history is a evaluation of intellectual and spiritual predecessors of the actual Islamic movement. So far as Afghans are concerned, articles and monographic publications deal with their role or serve to demonstrate their specific writings. For the Sunnites, it's the role of Niazi, who is honored, and for the Shiites, it's Ismail Bahi, who is identified as a guiding example of an early intellectual and spiritual opposition leader. Rewriting history may actively also be done by political groups or minorities who up to now never were given the opportunity of expressing themselves. Such was and is the case with the Hazaras. This ethnic group was, as many other minority groups in Afghanistan, never allowed to propagate their view of history. Indeed, if so, a lot of disagreeable questions would have been raised concerning the building of the modern Afghan state at the end of the 19th century. Since 1979, however, nearly 50 periodicals and several excellent historical works evaluating the role of the Hazaras in Afghan history, as well as their special history, have been published by Hazaras themselves. Because the Hazaras, the vast majority are followers of the Shiite branch of the Islamic teaching, they were from the beginning mainly organized in Iran and influenced by the political as well as ideological development there. That's why, in the publications, the notion of the historically and ethnically spoken special identity has often been set back in order to propagate an Islamic internationalism. The monographic essays, however mentioned, throw light on the history of the Hazaras as well as on their way of interpreting the Afghan history. With these few remarks about the different cultural political attitudes towards history and historical leaders, I may close. I would like, however, to shortly reconsider my initial interest in this paper, my own interest, which was more or less questions on or can we define this new literature as a beginning of a new, maybe even revolutionary culture? If one looks at the press and publication system of the Afghan resistance movement and tries to analyze the underlying values, ideas, and worldviews, it is very well possible to interpret the intellectual outcome of the last 12 years of violence as a base, as a beginning of a new revolutionary culture. A new revolutionary culture created at the loose side of a collective trauma. The term of revolutionary culture in connection with the intellectual results of the Afghan resistance movement implies, however, values different from what a Western intellectual would agree upon as being a progressive and revolutionary culture. The real question remains, however, in my opinion as a Westerner, not so much what different values each culture comprises, but whether the implementation of the new political culture and the political practice of the future Afghan society will be guided by democratic rules or dictated by the will and political interests of one man or one party. I thank you.
Who was suddenly taken ill. She's an anthropologist presently working in cheap trial on medical service provision and the attitudes and points of view of the Afghan population toward medical service. And I know from speaking to her that she was most interested in bringing to your attention the issue of expectations for services which have been increased in the formerly rural population of Afghanistan, which is now here, especially medical services, and the question of how those expectations are to be met in the future. She had various other things which we unfortunately miss out on. Our next speaker is Paul Bocodice, who is the guiding light of Biblioteca Afghanica and can tell us a good deal about documentation. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to thank Nancy Dupree and Professor Amin for the organization of this seminar and for my invitation. It's a great honor for me to speak on a subject which was very dear to Louis and to me myself, on such a well-informed audience. This subject of documentation for action and history was also the subject of our first discussion when we met, Louis and I, in Kabul in 1974. Since then, Afghanistan has got a major place in my life, and it's my main object to handle today besides my professional duties. In a circle of Afghanologues, it will not be necessary to present the Foundation Biblioteca Afghanica as a center of documentation and information on Afghanistan in detail. Most of you may have heard of it in recent times, but please keep in mind that this archive has existed for almost 20 years. It was officially opened to the public in 1975 during the time of Muhammad Dawood. So it is evident that Biblioteca Afghanica was not created with an anti-communist target, but with the purpose to support the knowledge of and the scientific research on Afghanistan's nature, culture, and history. These common interests were the basis of a long-lasting friendship with Louis and Nancy, and with the outcome of several publications. One special publication which was very important is the one on Afghan women, which was mentioned also yesterday. Since 1983, Bibliotheca Afghanica is under supervision of the Swiss government, financed by a most modest official contribution and mainly by private voluntary donations. Its original strong points have been the natural sciences, geography, geology and biology, the culture of Afghanistan, its archaeology and history. During the past 10 years, the focus had to be extended to the actual development and the problem of human rights violations. The military and political outcome of the present Afghan struggle for self-determination. At present time, our archive holds more than 13,000 books and offprints on Afghanistan in Western languages, and about 23 meters full shelves full of publications on Oriental languages, including an extensive collection of printed materials published by the Afghan resistance, which was brought together by Said Hamid Elmi and Jan Heon Grevemeyer, who has spoken about it just now. We have a special strong point in German publications on Afghanistan, which date back to the famous von Hentig-Niedermeyer expedition to Emir Habibullah in the 1916s. Von Hentig himself has donated all his materials to the foundation. Manuscripts and photographs, as well as all his bookkeeping for the expenses of this expedition. Also, most of the elaborated reports by Dr. Hendriksen on the German economic and agricultural development projects in Paktia and around Kabul during the 1960s and 70s are available in our archive. In a short while, we will receive original materials from the first scientific German mission to eastern Afghanistan, the German Hindu Kush expedition in 1935. Among the most asked titles by students from Swiss universities who visit Bibliotheca Afghanica are those on the subject of Afghan women. This is a very interesting matter that since almost 2 years a new rumor occurs among Western students about the circumcision of Afghan women. And this is one of the great good things which the Soviets have done, that they have abandoned the circumcision of Afghan women. A complete nonsense, which did never exist among Afghan women. And so you see also Documentation Center has also not only a positive aspect but also the negative aspect to avoid such false information. The other main requests are Louis Dupree's American University field staff reports. There's rarely one student who makes not use of these excellent publications which handle facts. Because of the extensive physical destruction inside Afghanistan which took place during the past 10 years, our phototape became more and more important. With about 12,000 slides and prints, with our films and videotapes, we can document the state of repair of most Afghan monuments back to 1915 to this Niedermeyer expedition, who made also a documentation on Afghan monuments, which was published in the famous Niedermeyer book on Afghanistan. During the last few years, we often have been asked how we can justify to continue such a scientific documentation work in a quiet, peaceful library atmosphere during a time of brutal war in Afghanistan. Wouldn't it be much more important to collect money for weapons, for medical and humanitarian aid to support the Afghan cause? Fortunately, we can prove that our work has not only a scientific value, but also a quite practical result. Our time came when the UN asked Professor Felix Makora to write his reports on human rights violations in Afghanistan in 1984. He was not allowed to enter Afghanistan. We contributed a computerized list of all known facts of cruelties, of killings and war damages. The result of this list was far more than we expected. Within a short time after the presentation of our research before the United Nations, the number of registered civilian casualties dropped from 6,000 to an average 1,200 per month, as later research showed. Soviet diplomats at the United Nations admitted that our computerized and by this way de-emotionalized list of thousands and thousands of facts was the main reason for this change, for the vanishing of this special Spetsnaz destructions of villages, which occurred, for example, especially in the part of Lahman. This was true documentation for action. It saved the lives of 4,800 people every month, a result which every humanitarian aid organization could be proud and satisfied. Today, the struggle against foreign troops in Afghanistan is over, but peace has not yet come back. An alien ideology still tries to conquer the Afghan spirit. Foreign weapons are still delivered to both sides, and the political influence of the neighbors of Afghanistan grows, adding new facets to the difficulties of finding a way to peace and self-determination. Still, the millions of refugees hesitate to return, and the big-scale reconstruction of Afghanistan is still far away. What can be done at this stage by a documentation center? First of all, this time should be used to gather as much information as possible on all aspects of present-day conditions in the country, as it is done today by Professor Hassan Gul and the Swedish committee in exemplary manner. Second, and of similar importance, is